My earliest recollection of being treated differently from my sister stretches back to when I was just 5 years old. I remember my mother painstakingly braiding Viola's hair in neatly lined plaits, complete with pink ribbons that matched her frilly dress, while I sat to the side in my worn-out overalls, waiting for my turn. It never came. She brushed my hair once and gathered it into an awkward ponytail, as if my appearance was barely worth her time. Even at that young age, something twisted inside me. I could feel the discrepancy, though I had no name for it. Viola was the golden child, the daughter who could do no wrong, the one whose every accomplishment was lauded in extravagant fashion. I was the afterthought, and also ran in the race for parental approval. If Viola misplaced her lunchbox, I was the first to be questioned. If she received a low grade, it was my fault for not tutoring her correctly. My parents overlooked my small achievements, an A on a quiz, a well-done painting, and instead reserved their praise for my sister's slightest triumphs. A part of me wanted desperately to be loved as she was, so I tried to help her, tried to be the supportive sibling they insisted I should be. Yet, my attempts always went unnoticed, overshadowed by Viola's next shining performance. Deep down, I understood that I was never going to match her brilliance in their eyes. That was my normal, second place in a two-person contest, always overshadowed by her glow. My parents never acknowledged the imbalance. They simply acted as though things were exactly as they should be, content in their favoritism, while I wilted silently under their blind devotion to Viola. As the years marched on, the tension in our household grew thicker. Every small incident triggered an interrogation aimed my way. If an earring went missing, if a vase ended up cracked, if homework mysteriously disappeared, eyes turned to me. I had grown used to the skepticism, yet it still stung. The worst blow came when Viola's prized silver bracelet vanished one weekend. She'd flaunted that bracelet for months, a shiny gift from our father for some achievement or another. One moment it was on her wrist, the next it was nowhere to be found. Immediately the accusations flew, laced with all the venom of presumed betrayal. My mother cornered me in the hallway, accusing me of stealing it out of jealousy. My father barked at me to own up to my misdeed, certain my guilt was undeniable. I tried explaining that I hadn't touched the bracelet, that I had no reason to take something so obviously hers. They refused to listen. Viola merely shrugged, her lips trembling as she said she couldn't imagine why I would do such a thing. Her performance was effective. She said just enough to stoke their outrage, but not enough to appear truly spiteful. They swallowed it whole, believing her sad little sigh over my repeated denials. That day became a before and after moment in my life. My parents' fragile trust in me, whatever minuscule portion existed, shattered. From then on, they watched me with wary eyes, as if waiting for the next piece of evidence to seal my fate. I was a mere teenager, pinned to the wall by their suspicion. Days dragged into weeks, but the bracelet never turned up. Viola made no effort to clear my name, nor did my parents relent in their unspoken accusations. Eventually, months later, Viola discovered her bracelet tucked away in the depths of her sock drawer. By then, it was too late to undo the damage. My parents had all but branded me a thief, treating me with frosty politeness at best, open hostility at worst. When Viola confessed she'd found it, she offered a half-hearted apology, telling our parents that maybe she'd misplaced it herself. But they never repaired the rift created by their earlier accusations. Instead, they seemed to double down, as though embarrassed to admit they might have been wrong about me. My father, who prided himself on never making mistakes, could not bring himself to say he was sorry. My mother, always tiptoeing around his temper, simply pretended the incident had never happened. Their dissatisfaction with me reached a tipping point on my 17th birthday. Viola, radiant in a new outfit, unwrapped her own gifts while I was presented with nothing more than a forced smile. After dinner, my father announced that he'd had enough of my so-called attitude and that if I wasn't willing to confess the ways I'd undermined Viola, I was no longer welcome under his roof. My mother stood at his side, silently complicit. Viola said nothing, just looked at me with wide eyes, feigning shock. A swirling mix of rage and heartbreak coursed through me. I had spent years trying to be the good child, to earn their acceptance, yet all they saw was a villain. A small part of me wanted to crumble, to beg them for forgiveness for sins I hadn't even committed, but a stronger part of me refused to kowtow. In that moment, I chose self-respect. I told them I wouldn't confess to a crime I had never committed. My father's face reddened, and he ordered me to leave. That night, I found myself on the curb with a single duffel bag, the door slammed shut behind me. I called a friend who lived across town, and she let me sleep on her couch for a few nights while I figured out what to do. My hands shook as I scrolled through local job listings, desperate for any way to support myself. Eventually, I found a dishwashing job at a small diner. The pay was meager, but it was enough to cover rent on a tiny basement room where the walls were perpetually damp. It was a harsh, abrupt initiation into adulthood, and some nights I lay awake, tears burning my eyes, furious at the family that had cast me aside. Still, with each dawn, I rose for work, determined to survive. I stopped attending high school events because I couldn't bear the curious stares or the questions. Instead, I poured my energy into finishing my education quietly, piecing together homework in between shifts. My parents never called to ask if I was safe or hungry. Viola never sent a single text. They had effectively erased me from their lives. The one ray of light in those bleak months was my grandmother, my father's mother, who hunted me down after hearing whispers of what had happened. She walked into the diner one afternoon, surprising me so much that I almost dropped a plate of pancakes. Her eyes glistened with sympathy as she reached for my hand. Without fuss or condemnation, she offered me some cash, telling me that I was loved and that she believed in me. She was a lifeline I clung to, a reminder that not everyone in my bloodline viewed me as an outcast. I accepted her help gratefully, vowing to pay it forward someday. In time, I managed to enroll in a community college, juggling classes by day and shifts at the diner by night. My grandmother's unwavering support made it possible. She would send me handwritten letters, each one brimming with gentle words of encouragement. Whenever I felt myself drowning in loneliness, I'd read those letters and feel a spark of hope. She confided in me too, revealing her own struggles in her younger years. Much like me, she had been underestimated, dismissed by people who failed to see her potential. She understood the sting of being overlooked, which made her empathy all the more powerful. During one of our Sunday lunches, occasions she insisted upon, despite my hectic schedule, she pressed a small wooden box into my hands. She explained that it contained important documents, trinkets of sentimental value, and letters that she wanted me to read if anything ever happened to her. She didn't dwell on morbid details, only saying that she trusted me to honor her wishes. Life continued, battered but not broken. I finished my associate's degree, then transferred to a 4-year institution on a partial scholarship. My grandmother's pride was tangible, beaming from every phone call and every quiet smile at the dinner table. The rest of my family never appeared, never called, never offered a single word of support. Eventually, I accepted the truth. I was no longer part of their world. My sister's photos still peppered their social media feeds, capturing an endless parade of milestones and celebrations. Meanwhile, I carved out my own corner of the universe, forging friendships, building a life I could be proud of. It wasn't easy, but it was mine. Years passed, and my grandmother's health began to deteriorate. Her once lively stride became tentative. When she finally slipped away late one night, I was at her bedside, holding her fragile hand and whispering words of gratitude. She never fully regained consciousness in her final hours, but I believe she sensed my presence. In the aftermath of her passing, I felt unmoored, as if the only anchor I'd ever had was gone. Still, I had to handle her arrangements. The funeral was modest yet respectful, a gathering of acquaintances and distant relatives. I caught sight of my parents and Viola standing by the church doors in tense silence. They nodded at me in reluctant acknowledgement, but no warm greetings were exchanged. I said my goodbyes to Grandma with a heavy heart, eulogizing her as the one person who had shown me unwavering kindness. Afterward, when the lawyer read her will, I discovered she had left me everything: her house, her savings, even a modest stock portfolio. My parents exchanged bewildered, irritated looks. Viola, decked out in a designer dress, gawked in disbelief. They demanded explanations, insisting that Grandma had been confused or manipulated, but the paperwork was in order, the bequest crystal clear. I felt the weight of it settle on my shoulders, both a gift and a final testament of her belief in me. My parents cornered me in the hallway, their tones tight with urgency, suggesting that I should at least split the inheritance. My mother mentioned fairness, as if fairness had ever been a principle they practiced. My father muttered something about doing the right thing, conveniently ignoring all the wrong they'd done by me. I simply shook my head, clutching the wooden box to my chest, refusing to entertain their pleas. A week later, I moved into Grandma's house. It smelled of lavender and faintly of old leather, the remnants of her presence woven into every room. Her smiling photos still hung on the walls, and for the first few nights, I found myself standing in front of them, whispering my thanks. Tucked away in a closet, I found carefully labeled boxes of mementos, photographs of my childhood, drawings I had made when I was too young to remember. She'd cherished them all, quietly, while my parents championed only Viola's achievements. I opened the wooden box she'd left me and discovered a stack of letters addressed to me, each penned in her tidy script. They were heartfelt missives praising my resilience, my determination, my capacity for forgiveness. In one letter, she confessed that she had chosen to leave her estate to me because she understood the injustice I had endured, and she wanted me to have a secure future. If my parents or sister found that arrangement unfair, then so be it. She believed in balance, in righting wrongs. Her words brought tears to my eyes, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to cry openly, releasing a grief I hadn't realized I was carrying. I spent the following months settling into the house, tending the little flower garden Grandma had cherished, and focusing on my career. My calls went unanswered by my parents, which suited me just fine. Viola texted once, demanding to know how I could be so selfish. I let the message sit unread. I had no desire to engage with her manipulations. If it was selfish to finally prioritize my own well-being after years of being undervalued, then so be it. I wore that label like a badge of honor. Life regained a semblance of normalcy. I began considering ways to use my inheritance wisely, maybe open a bookstore, perhaps invest in furthering my education. Despite the heartache, I felt an undercurrent of gratitude. Grandma had given me a chance to break free from the weight of my family's rejection. Then, one crisp autumn morning, I was awakened by relentless pounding on my door. Peering through the peephole, I saw my parents and Viola huddled on the porch. My mother's eyes were red and puffy. My father looked visibly thinner, his shoulders slumped in a way that seemed almost contrite. Viola shifted restlessly, biting her lip. I hesitated before turning the lock. The chill in the air rushed in as I opened the door, greeting them with guarded silence. My mother immediately launched into a tearful explanation. Viola's business venture had failed spectacularly, leaving her saddled with crushing debt. My parents, who had co-signed loans, now faced foreclosure on their house. They'd come to me, the new owner of Grandma's estate, hoping I would bail them out. My father's pride seemed to have crumbled as he offered a quiet plea, something I'd never heard from him before. Viola stood by, her expression a mixture of desperation and entitlement, as though I owed them a rescue. I listened without showing any emotion, arms folded across my chest. The memory of that basement apartment, of sleepless nights spent scrubbing plates for meager wages, flashed through my mind. The indignation of being tossed aside, replaced by their unwavering devotion to Viola, churned in my stomach. The gall they had to show up now, in tears, as if that erased the years of neglect and pain they inflicted on me. My response teetered on the edge of pity and fury. I ushered them into the living room, the scent of Grandma's lavender potpourri still lingering in the air. My mother's story spilled out in gasping sobs, the bank's deadlines, the mounting interest, the desperation that brought them to my door. My father sat with his head bowed, occasionally adding a hoarse plea. Viola tried to reach for my hand, but I pulled away. Her bright eyes glistened with tears, yet I found no sympathy rising in my chest. All I could think of was how easily she'd stood by while I was cast out, how she'd never once lifted her voice to defend me. She told me I was being cruel, that family should help family, no matter the past. Her words lit a fuse inside me. Family? Where was that notion of family when I was broke and homeless, when I was fending for myself at 17? They had cut me loose like a rotting branch. Now, with their house on the line, they miraculously remembered we shared the same blood. My mother clasped her hands together, pointing out how Grandma would have wanted me to show compassion. I felt a surge of anger. Grandma had indeed been compassionate. To me, the disregarded child. She'd given me a roof over my head when she bequeathed this house and a chance at stability when nobody else would. My mother's hypocrisy was laid bare, her tears smacking of guilt rather than genuine remorse. I let them speak, let them plea and beg. Then, in a voice I hardly recognized as my own, I told them no. I would not save their home, would not assume responsibility for Viola's recklessness. The silence that followed was deafening. My parents stared at me as if I were a stranger, as if they didn't understand how we'd come to this point. I watched them leave, tears streaming down their faces, their once inflated pride deflated into remorse. A part of me almost faltered, almost caved to the pang of guilt that pricked my conscience. But a stronger part reminded me of every restless night, every hungry morning, every humiliation I suffered while they lavished care on Viola. My decision wasn't about vindictiveness alone, it was about refusing to compromise my self-worth for people who never recognized it. Once their car disappeared down the street, I closed the door and leaned against it, my heart pounding. Memories swirled, the lost bracelet that ended my childhood security, the basement room I had to call home, the joy on Grandma's face when she saw me carving out a life despite my parents' desertion. All of it led me here, to this moment of final reckoning. I might have helped them if they had shown the slightest repentance years ago, if they had acknowledged the pain they caused, or tried to make amends before their finances collapsed. Instead, their apologies only surfaced when they needed a savior. My grandmother's inheritance was an inheritance of love and faith in me, not a resource for them to exploit. In my quiet living room, I could almost feel her gentle hand resting on my shoulder. For a long moment, I simply stood there, letting the echoes of their pleas fade. Then I turned and walked to the mantel, where a framed photo of Grandma and me stood. Under her kind gaze, I felt no regret for my choice. I had upheld my dignity, honored her memory, and found a semblance of peace that had long eluded me. Without a backward glance, I whispered my goodbye to the family that never was, determined to live fully on my own terms.